All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Super excited for everyone to be here and everyone to be able to witness this super cool conversation. It's cool because I just don't think the conversation's being had. And I would love to, um, I don't know, like just pull back the curtain on why it's happening, what's appropriate, and also just make the community that we have know that this is a safe space and that we're always trying to be educated and learn more. So, with that said, my name is Victoria Reese, as most of you may know, and I am co founder of We Are Ill and president of We Are Ill. And We Are Ill is here to redefine what sick looks like. We are not one race, we are not one size, we are not one age, we are not one body type, one mobility level, like all of the things. We are not anything but we're everything at the same time. So I will let my amazing guest introduce herself and tell us what she's about.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I'm so excited to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the invitation and, just a big hello to everybody that's tuning in and watching. I'm super, super excited to be here. So my name is Vanessa Sapien, and I am a 33-year-old Latina female diagnosed with spina bifida from birth. So I have been a wheelchair user since I was 3 years old and have really been an activist since childhood. I was raised by a powerhouse single mom who was really early in the movement and really kind of paved the way for me. So I was kind of following her around and, kind of got my activism legs really early on. But a little bit more about me is currently I am the mental health program director for an international nonprofit called Just Detention International. So I actually work really closely with incarcerated communities, specifically those that are incarcerated who are survivors of sexual abuse in detention. So that is sort of my 9 to 5. And prior to that, I was a film and television actress for about 20 years, fighting for accurate portrayals of people with disabilities in media, which is still very dear and close to my heart. Once an actor, always an actor. But yeah, so, activism and arts and entertainment, detention. And then I am also a former ambassador for Disability Rights California, and I was also an ambassador for Abilities Expo of Los Angeles and the Spina Bifida Association. So, definitely just the activism runs deep with me, and I'm just really excited to be here today to talk about language and disability and what that all means and what does it need to mean. And we're just really, really excited to have this conversation because I cannot agree with you more that these conversations are not being had. And it still blows my mind that that is the case.
Yep, totally agree. Okay, so we're here today. I'm really excited about it. All right, so I'm excited about it also because in the MS community, we have everybody's on the spectrum of whatever, right? We've got people as far as mobility, we
Mhm.
have people like myself who I don't have issues all the time. I may because I have relapsing
Mhm.
remitting MS. When I have a flare up, and in the past when I've had a flare up, I have had issues where I couldn't walk. I couldn't use my arms and things like that because of numbness. But it goes away when I'm in remission. So that's not something that is a permanent thing for me. But we do have
Right.
MS sisters and brothers who do use mobility aids and may be more easily identified as someone who is disabled. Even
Right.
myself, like I have a handicap placard. Do I use it all the time? No. May I need it sometimes? Yes. But the to the eye, I'm not a part of that community, right? But to the
Mhm.
eye, you may be. You're in a wheelchair, correct?
Mhm. Yeah, I am.
So same, we are not in the same situation, but in certain circumstances, could I be in that same situation to the eye where people would see that I am a part of the community as well? Yes. And
Mhm.
I say this is important and I'm excited to talk about it because our community is broad and we actually have everybody in this community. People have optic neuritis. They don't have, they don't use a cane, but they can't see, or they have seeing issues. Like at the end of the day, I want everyone to feel welcome in this community and seen. And I can't speak to someone or speak for someone who is in a wheelchair all the time. I can't. And
Mhm.
I want to make
Mhm.
but I want to make sure that I'm including the people that do identify with that. And I want to make sure that when it's being discussed, that I myself, but also those around us, know what to say and what not to say and what's appropriate and things like that. So let's get right into it. So as you and I discussed, I have some things I want to touch on, but I also want us to just flow and talk. But I do want to
Yeah.
set the tone and set the stage for some things by defining some terms. So, what does disabled mean? I got some definitions here. One, to
Mhm.
cause something to be unable to work in the normal way. The other is
Yeah.
to impair physically or mentally, to cause disability in an illness that disabled thousands, or to make ineffective, unfit, or incapable as by crippling. So that is the
Mm.
definition. How does that make you feel? What does that raise for you? Correct the definition. Let's redefine. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, right, we all need definitions, right? It helps us kind of understand, make sense of all of these different things. But I mean, come on, Victoria, like normal, what is that? Right? Like what is normal? Incapable, not able, so I feel like these definitions can be really hurting more than they are helping us sometimes, right? And I think that if we talked about disability more and really kind of removed the stigma of disability that still very much exists. And so I think that's a really, really tall order. But because that stigma is still there, that these definitions are only kind of perpetuating these misconceptions that people have about disability. Because one of the things, you and I've already spoken before. I love you. I think you're amazing. Like we hit it off right away, on that first initial phone call. And, you're so right. Like your disability is invisible most of the time, right? There's on occasion where it flares up, but for the most part, your disability is very much invisible, whereas mine isn't. But I think one of the things that you and I quickly figured out that we do have in common is that neither one of us fits the mold about what people think disability is, right? So you don't fit the mold of MS or what people would expect of MS, of somebody who's living with MS. And even though I am a wheelchair user, I oftentimes don't fit the mold of what people think a wheelchair user is, right? And so, as you know, I also know your sister, the amazing Tanji. Hi, Tanji, if you're watching. Um, and, Tanji and I worked together for a really long time in detention facilities. And I'm never what people expect, right? So I'm going in there, I'm going to go and talk about sexual abuse in detention. Facilities are not the most accessible places, right? When you think about prisons and jails, they are not the most accessible places. And I'm in there to talk about really sensitive issues and topics. And a lot of it's over the phone until I show up. And I'm never what anybody expects, right? Nobody ever expects the paraplegic Latina to be the one that's going to come in and help them with these issues. And so I face that a lot, right? And not even just that, but just even in just sort of day-to-day things. I mean, the fact that I drive, and I use a vehicle, right? And I'm independent in that way. The fact that I have the word director in my title at my work, so I just think little things like that. And the fact that I am fiercely independent, right? And I think that these definitions don't allow for that, right? Like they don't kind of foster the ability for us to feel like we are entitled and have the right to be fully independent individuals. And I think that's the bottom line about this whole language thing, right? Is like, first of all, people first language is number one, right? We need to adopt people first language where the person comes first and the disability comes second. And we still have a long way to go with that. And I see you shaking your head, and I'm sure every person with a disability agrees, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that people first language, and I think that these definitions, and because we don't use people first language, it doesn't allow for us to really be independent. But I think when we talk about disability, that's really key, is that regardless of what the disability is, we're all striving to be as independent as possible. And that's going to look different from person to person, right? And so for me, I think as a person with a physical disability who uses a wheelchair, there's two sides of the conversation. And I think that there's a lot of fear for some people around ever wanting to use a wheelchair and what that means. And then there are also people like myself who I tried when I was younger to use, walkers and crutches and the whole thing. And for me personally, that was really limiting physically. I found that I couldn't really get around as easily and that I was a lot slower when I was having to use those mobility aids versus when I got my first set of wheels at age 3, I was ready to go. And that just kind of opened up my whole world. And so I get it that for some people, the thought of using a wheelchair means decline. And so absolutely try to be as physically active and independent for as long as you possibly can. But if we can remove the stigma of what it means to use a wheelchair, then maybe for folks where that is, an inevitability, it won't be as big a deal, if that time were to ever come for that person.
Got you, got you. So I want to bring it back a little bit to some of the words used in the definition. And
Yeah.
I think you mentioned unfit, but unfit. Oh, you said normal, normal, uh, the ineffective, unfit, incapable,
Yeah.
crippling. Now,
Mhm.
by definition, some of these words could potentially, like, those are part of the definition. But even if we define
Mhm.
those particular words, I feel like some of the words, they define what they're saying. Like if you look at the definition, you know what they're saying. But is it the
Yeah.
word choice or is it the stigma that comes with the word? Because when I read crippling, I'm like, that's shady. Like, I don't like that word. But is
Right.
it the word or is it what comes with the word that is the problem
Mhm.
or typically the problem?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's the stigma that comes with the word, right? A word means nothing and holds absolutely no power unless there is a stigma attached to it.
Mhm.
I feel like we are constantly adopting and relinquishing words all the time, right? As the culture sort of changes. I'm thinking about just even like with the LGBT community, the word queer, right? Like for a long time, that was a taboo word and a word that wasn't a word that we should use. And then it gets brought back again, right? Or I feel like different communities were constantly taking back, words that, um, and reinventing what they mean, right? For ourselves and kind of finding liberation in that. And so I think that it's always about the stigma. And I think we need to kind of constantly readopt these words and reinvent what that means. And for me, there are a lot of people that say, oh, no, 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 like I'm not disabled or don't want to identify with the disability community as a whole, right? And I get that. And I don't ever throw shade at people who are in that space, right? Like not wanting to identify as a person with a disability. And like a really good example was one of the hospitals that I frequently go to, they had this really interesting system where they would ask somebody, okay, do you identify as having a disability? And the person had the right to say yes or no. And then the follow-up question would be, have you been diagnosed with anything? Like a long-term diagnosis. And then the person who maybe said no to the disability question would say yes to the lifelong diagnosis. And so I thought that was a really interesting approach. And I thought that that was really sort of trauma informed. But I would love to see a day when people who do have lifelong diagnoses that technically fall under disability have no problem saying, yes, I have a disability. And I'm totally okay with that.
Yeah.
And so I think removing the stigma, right? So you have a disability. What does that mean? That as long as society feels that disability is less than or less capable, I feel like more and more people are not going to want to identify as having a disability.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay. So as it relates, I'm going to bring it in specific to the MS community. I Googled this, everyone. Just want you guys to know. I'm no medical scholar here. Um, it says that the truth is that 15 years after the onset of MS, only about 20% of patients are bedridden or institutionalized. Another
Yeah.
20% may require a wheelchair or use crutches or a cane to ambulate, but fully 60% will be ambulatory without assistance, and some will have
Hmm.
little deficit at all. 50% of Americans with MS cannot work. It's a little bit more information. Someone with MS can qualify for disability benefits if it is severe enough to prevent them from being able to work full time. So
Hmm.
I brought this up just so that we could really, again, set the tone of like who we're talking to.
Yeah.
Where, you may have MS, but this may not really talk to you specifically, or you may not be dealing with some of these issues or being labeled or label yourself or identify as disabled.
Yeah.
So when it comes to this in general, like in everyday conversation, right? I'm sure
Hmm.
you've had some interesting conversations with people where they may have used an inappropriate term or used a term that was inappropriate to you or something you didn't identify with or you didn't feel comfortable with. Because I know with MS, we talk about this all the time. Man, people project. They project. They project. They're uncomfortable or unsure
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
you know they're like weirded out by your vulnerability or openness about your illness, so they get really
Hmm.
weird and they start to say really weird things. So I
Hmm.
wanted to ask you, have you had those experiences, any at all? What were those, and how do you address them, or like could you give tips on that?
Yeah, no, so I'm so glad that you're lifting all this up because so many things are coming to mind for me. It's just that there's so much there. So first, to address your question head on, yes, absolutely. And I feel like the number one question that I get, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this, especially if they have visible disabilities, is what's wrong with you? And there's so much wrong with that question that's the way it get at that's the way it gets asked. So it's the number one. It's like, oh, what's wrong with you? And I just always respond, oh, nothing. Are you okay? I most of the time I don't know how to respond to that because it's coming out of left field. You know what I mean? Like I'm in the grocery store shopping and I'm doing what I feel is like exercising my right to be independent. And so to you, it may look like I'm in a struggle trying to get the avocado that's like all the way on the top shelf. But if I get it, that's a win for me. You know what I mean? Like I did it just as well as you did. Just because it took me longer and just because I had to stretch to get it doesn't make that, victory any less than yours. So it usually just comes out of left field, when you're just trying to live your life and do your thing, right? Um, and so I think that's number one. But I think what you're talking about is like microaggressions, right? So it's not even so much questions, but it's like behavior. And I think that's the thing is it's like for me, a lot of the times it's sort of like lack of dialogue, right? It's not even in so much the things that people say, but it's in the things that people do. Like I've lost count the number of times that somebody feels it's okay to just like come up behind me and push my wheelchair without being asked, without asking me. Or they ask me, but they're not really asking me, they'll be like, oh, can I push you? And then before I have a chance to respond, there I am. And that's like really traumatizing. I
Mhm.
always tell people, and I share with my students, because I neglected to mention in the beginning that I'm also an adjunct professor. And so I'm teaching to my students who are going to, who are aspiring therapists. And so, for me, it's the equivalent of somebody like literally lifting you off the ground without asking permission. And if someone did that, they would end up in jail. You know what I mean? Like if some random stranger just like up and decided that they were going to just lift you up off the ground and carry you up a flight of stairs, like that's assault. So it's things like that. It's the what's wrong with you. It's the staring. And then I think also it's that because, going back to what we were saying about not fitting the mold, it's that, oh my gosh, like you're such an inspiration because I got out of my car, because I'm out and about in my day to day life, just doing things that anyone else does. But because I have a disability, all of a sudden that makes me an inspiration. And so that's also a big challenge for me and a big no-no. I'm like, get to know me first and find out the things that I've accomplished and achieved. And then you can call me an inspiration. But because I woke up this morning and decided to do my hair and go to the grocery store, that doesn't qualify.
Yeah.
But, going back to what you were saying, because I do think it's really, really important, when you were talking about the statistics around MS, that's something that I can relate to, even though I don't have MS, but I think a lot of people within the disability community can relate to, is for all of us, who have a lifelong diagnosis or have a disability, we all went through that moment in time when we got our diagnoses and the doctors told us everything that could go wrong with in relationship to our disability. We've all had that moment. That's one of the things that binds us together as a community, right? That's why we are one culture. That's why we identify as our own specific community, because we've all had those similar experiences, and this is one of them, you know? And I went through it too. Granted, I don't remember it because I was, 0 years old, and my mom really had to shoulder that. But, I was told that I wouldn't be able to sit, walk, talk, that I could be in a vegetative state. I mean, it was just this laundry list of things that my mother was told would potentially happen to me. And the only thing that ended up being true is that I'm paralyzed. Literally nothing else on that list came true. And I think that's the other sort of damaging thing that happens to our community, is that we're all kind of functioning from a place of trauma, in my opinion. I mean, those conversations need to be different. The bedside manner needs to be different, and the conversation needs to be framed in such a way of like, hey, you have this diagnosis, and these are all of the things that could happen, but we're going to wait and see because you're Victoria, you're Vanessa, and we have no idea what is going to happen with you and your specific case and your life, but I'm here for it. I'm along for the ride as your doctor, and let's see what happens. And as these symptoms come up or may not, we're going to deal with it. And I'm going to support you every step of the way. And I bet every single person watching did not have that experience, myself included. And as you're nodding, I bet the same didn't happen for you either. So that's a real thing that I think needs to change.
Yeah. Ooh, girl, you hit so many nails on the head. And you're right. I didn't get that. And then, when you do your research, it's like hitting you over the head of like the extremes.
Yeah,
And I understand having that information to be helpful, but like,
absolutely.
it's a lot. It's a lot. And it would be so much better if it's presented as we're going to see what happens with Victoria or with Vanessa.
Hmm.
These
Hmm.
are the things, but it's like that's a moment. You spend a moment on that, and then we're going to say, but we're
Hmm.
going to take this a day at a time, and we're going to deal with what we're dealing with right now. Where you are right now. I
Hmm.
can't tell you the amount of people who, like, right when I got diagnosed, they would send me these videos about people who would go from what seemed to be 100% healthy to completely paralyzed or disabled in 2 years. So you're sending me
Yeah,
rapid, things
progression
like
of your
progression.
disability.
Like,
Yeah.
why are you doing that? So that's so real. And so some of the things
Hmm.
you said made me feel like, the people that maybe grabbed your wheelchair to help you, how
Hmm.
they were helping. And I think, we are in a space of people taking back words and
Hmm.
really owning. You mentioned the word independent a lot, which
Hmm.
I don't think a lot of people think about, like what that means to you in that moment.
Hmm.
Have that,
Hmm.
it's a win, and they're trying to be helpful.
Hmm.
So how would you suggest someone who is that type of person? They're positive, and they're trying to be helpful. And how would you suggest them manage the situations, because they don't want to be
Yeah.
offensive, but they are, essentially, like you
Yeah.
said, that's like
Yeah.
lifting someone off the ground. How would you
Yeah.
suggest someone from the outside manage situations like that? What's the most respectful and appropriate way to go about things?
I mean, for me, I just think I get it. I'm a very like understanding person, and I'm not one that's like easily angered by the ignorance that society has around disability, because I
Good for
understand that
you.
it's there. And again, no judgment to people who are, because we have a right to be. I have a right to be upset if somebody does that to me. But for me, I've just learned that the calmer I can be in a situation, the more it'll be a teachable moment for the other person. But that's a really, really hard thing to do. And it's a constant everyday battle. And sometimes it's a battle I lose, if I'm being honest. But for the most part, I do try to be understanding. But for me, the bottom line is, if you're not sure, first of all, please do ask, because most of the time, and this, again, this is just for me, but most of the time, if you don't ask and you walk away, whatever idea you have in your head about what the answer is to the question that you didn't ask, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be wrong. So I'd rather you ask me and have right information or information from a credible source than leave and go about your merry way, not really understanding, what I'm about or what disability is about. So I encourage people to ask and then just respond to whatever the person says. I mean, it's a really simple formula. I think that the issue comes in the fact that we just try to overcomplicate it because they're uncomfortable, right? And like, that's where hate comes from. That's where discrimination comes from. That's where ableism comes from. That's where racism comes from. It's from our own discomfort. It has nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with us not knowing how to respond to it. And so I feel like these situations are no different, where ask because you genuinely want to know and respect whatever answer I give you. So if you want to help me because you're uncomfortable and you ask if you can help and I turn you down, you have to live with that and you have to respect that. And you need to walk away from the situation and let me do me. So that's my advice to everybody, is ask and then genuinely respond to what the person says and not make it about you.
That's so important. That's so important because it's not the same thing at all. But what we're talking about is really hitting heavy on my heart of the balance of really thinking of not strangers, but people who are close to you, people who want to help you, but also doesn't understand the balance of allowing you to have your independence and wanting to help, but also knowing that sometimes when people need help, they don't say they need help. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because
Right.
let's say for me and my partner or something, it's like, yeah, I want to figure it out for myself, but then sometimes I'm like, but you didn't even ask me, you didn't even offer or something. So, there's that healthy balance, but
Absolutely.
essentially
Absolutely.
asking would at least nip it in the bud where, well, I asked and you said, and then we move
Right.
forward in that direction based off that.
Right.
And I love that
Right.
you're breaking it down in that way because, that was my point of bringing it up. I think that people are like, they may not be offensive at all, but they're like not asking, but they're like, if you reach for something, they think you can't reach it, or they think that you probably don't want to try to reach it. They're gonna go and do it, and you might be offended by that. Like, let me do me. If I
Mm-hmm.
need help, I'll ask. And I just think that that is the answer. Just ask, so that we can now
Just that.
go from there.
Right. Because, my way isn't going to be someone else's way. You know what I mean? And that's okay. There are other people out there who maybe prefer to have a little bit more support, where independence isn't one of their greatest values. And that's perfectly okay. Because, like we've been saying, it's independence by your own definition, right? By your own definition, because we're all different. And that's just the way that I choose to be independent. But that may not be somebody else's way. And, I don't mean to throw us off track, but I was really inspired by a lot of the things that you were saying earlier on. And it just really kind of brought up a lot for me. And I think even just going back to like your very, very first question around words and definitions and disability, I think because we're here to talk about language, I think another important point that we need to bring up for people is that a lot of our language is also trapped in benefits and services. And I think that that's a really important point that we need to like lift up for people and kind of shed a light on, is that because people with disabilities are a community and a culture that are very much dependent on services and benefits more than other people are, because we need really good health insurance and health coverage and, mobility aids, and just need a lot of things covered. And we may find ourselves in the hospital, maybe more than the average person, we're also kind of caught up in a system that is requiring us to identify certain ways and almost kind of present ourselves as sick and stay sick so that we can get the necessary supports and services that we need. Mm-hmm. And I want to reach out to my community and just, really lift that up and show support that, like, we are navigating a really difficult spot and situation where we want to change the narrative and define who we are for ourselves. And yet at the same time, we are constantly being sucked back in to this vicious cycle of having to identify as sick, as being having to identify as being dependent in order for us to get the necessary goods and services that we need. And that is such a mind game that is not easy. It is really difficult and honestly keeps a lot of us down, and creates a lot of the depression and the anxiety and all of these other negative statistics that we see with people with disabilities, and is really just sort of enabling us to not move forward and advance as a people. So I think for me, that's one of the things that I ultimately want to lift up in terms of the importance of language, is that language in a lot of ways continues to keep us trapped.
Ooh, child. That makes me think about so many things that I really, I want to peel it back, but I don't think we got the time to peel it back and really dissect that. Okay, so we're almost at time, and I would like to do like a rapid fire kind of situation here. I'm gonna throw out some words, and then you can tell me, I don't know, you can say what's on your mind. You can say,
Okay.
You can say, no, no. Or you can say, okay. And feel free to, I want to say feel free to, that you should answer for what you're comfortable with, but I also think that generalizing or maybe specifying if maybe this is okay for people, but not okay for me or whatever.
Mhm.
Disabled,
Me, proud.
crippled,
Mm. Old school. Not not anymore.
ineffective,
Mm. Man, when we when we stop fighting, when we stop talking, when we stop communicating about the things that are important.
hmm, incapable,
Only if you decide to be. That's a decision.
handicap,
Again, for me, just old fashioned, not something that I can relate to.
physically challenged,
Sometimes, and that's okay.
differently abled.
Yeah, why not? Absolutely.
Okay, that's all I got. That's all I got. But no, I love that. Love that we had that because I think people don't know what to say, and we are in a space where people are taking back terms, right? So, like,
Yeah.
it'll be old school. It'll be a term that's appropriate, deemed appropriate. Then it'll be not appropriate. This is society. I'm going on waves of society. Then it's not appropriate, and then
Mhm.
it's semi-appropriate because people will take back the word. And this isn't just disabled community. This is many communities
Right,
where there's a
right,
wave
right.
here, so people don't catch the wave all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that it's very important and very special when we say and honor that everyone has their own relationship with terms and what they deem
Mhm.
acceptable and what they feel is appropriate. But I think that I hate when people talk about stuff that they don't, it's not about them. Like I wouldn't have this
Right,
conversation with somebody that couldn't speak on this. You know what I mean? So like
right,
I'm not gonna
right,
speak on what's appropriate or not, but I could facilitate a conversation with someone who could. And you can tell me what believe in and how you
right.
feel, and we can go off of that. But that doesn't mean that everyone feels that same way. I just love that we're
Mm.
having this conversation. I think it's perfect that we're having it with you because, like you mentioned, my Tanji, you actually, some of the things you've said remind me of her, but it's because you have the language. you have the language. And
Mm.
you mentioned, you said something and it was so good. You were like, basically you were saying that the person, they understood that they were trauma knowledgeable or something. You said something where like they spoke in a way that they knew that trauma could potentially be present. So they spoke in a way. I don't know what you said, but it was so good. But you were like trauma
I'm trying to
knowledgeable.
remember.
I don't know what it was. I wish I thought about it 2 seconds ago, but I was like, "Ooh, what trauma informed," is what you said.
Yeah, trauma
But just
informed. Yeah,
that, like language is so important because
it
when you say
it's
things
everything.
like trauma informed, that took me aback. I'm like, what does she mean by that? Oh, this person is informed enough about traumas that someone could potentially have been be dealing with or have
Yeah,
experienced. And because of that
yeah,
knowledge, they dealt with a situation in a way,
yeah,
in a
yeah,
careful, intentional way. But how
yeah,
heavy and amazing is that, that they are trauma
yeah,
informed? And then how amazing is just those two words as a descriptor? How, like,
yeah,
that sets a fire, and a domino
yeah.
effect of like, oh, I'm trauma informed by doing this, or I want to be more trauma
Mhm.
informed. I just, words are so important,
Yeah.
man.
And I think, for those of us, and and again, not everybody has to be an activist, you know what I mean? Like everybody's just kind of on their own journey. But I think for folks like you and me that are comfortable with being vocal and are looking for platforms to be heard, I appeal to our community to really, I think we need to speak up, especially to the medical community, but really essentially any community of folks that are going to or foresee themselves working with people with disabilities at any point in their lives, to talk to them and communicate with these folks so that they are trauma informed. So one of the things that's really important to me is, I am an adjunct professor for MFT students who are going to become therapists. I've also spoken to medical students. I've also spoken to physical therapy PhD candidates, people that most likely are going to have greater connection or contact or access to people with disabilities. And it's so, so important that we be a part of those conversations, that we be a part of that educational process, you know, not just learning about how to treat people with disabilities, treat in the medical sense, but like, how do you treat us? Because I truly feel like 90% of our success rate outcomes are going to be based more on how people treat us as human beings, more so than how they're going to treat our conditions. I care more about how you treat me as a person. You went to school and you have all the medical knowledge to treat me with spina bifida. I get all of that. But if you don't keep in mind how to be trauma informed in the way that you communicate with me, that is going to impact the outcome of this treatment, of this procedure, of this surgery, of this therapy, of whatever it is that you want to do with me. It's all in the delivery. And so I think we really, really need to be a part of these conversations. We need to appeal to these people that have more direct access to us and really control the narrative and make sure that it truly is trauma informed, because nobody gets into their profession wanting to do harm. And I think unless they know how to be trauma informed, they can. And I just think it's really important for people to keep in mind.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Well, last thing before we go, are there anything, I don't know, you mentioned that with acting and things like that, or maybe I think you said writing for scripts or something like that to make sure that it was inclusive. But could you elaborate
Mhm.
on that, what you did and why it's so important?
Yeah, I mean, I was an actor for over 20 years, fighting for accurate portrayals of people with disability in media. And,
That's
and even though
mhm.
I've kind of, removed myself temporarily and have been focusing more on mental health for the last few years, it's still very much an active part of my life. And I think it's really important because whether we like it or not, media really helps inform culture and how we respond and treat certain people, or everybody, really. I just think that media is so, so powerful. And one of the challenges that I think people with disability face every single day is just not seeing ourselves represented in film and television or in magazines or in anything related to entertainment. And then when we do see ourselves represented, it's always number one, I don't know where we got this idea of having to overcome our disabilities. I have never felt like my disability is ever anything that I've needed to overcome, and that we don't want to produce stories in film and television unless that is the narrative. Unless this person is going to because what does it mean to overcome your disability? It means to be less disabled in the end, right? Like that's, in my opinion, that's what we are feeding society is like, oh my gosh, they overcame their disability. Well, in the end, it was, oh, well, now they can walk. At the start of the movie, they couldn't, and at the end, now they can. It's continuing to perpetuate this cycle of our understanding of disability that makes non-disabled people feel comfortable. I want to feel comfortable at the end of this movie. I want to see that this person is now less disabled than when they started. And I don't want to produce film or television that is going to continue to perpetuate that narrative. The person can be disabled at the beginning of the movie and still the same level of disability at the end of the movie, and it's totally fine. And I think the other issue that we're facing is that we're constantly seeing really talented and gifted actors play people with disabilities, and we're not being allowed to play ourselves. And so I think that's another really, really big issue in Hollywood and entertainment today, is that we're still not being allowed to play and portray ourselves. And, I know from being in the industry for a really, really long time that one of the prevailing arguments is, oh, well, we're going to cast this A-list actor in this film because for 5 minutes of the movie, they can walk. And so we can't cast a person with a disability in this role because for 5 minutes, they have to be able to walk. And I'm always sort of looking at these movies thinking, you could have done without that scene. that really didn't need to happen. You could have just cast a disabled actor. And so I think, there needs to be greater accountability that if we are going to produce content about our community, that it also creates opportunities for employment for us. Right. And so one of my friends that I want to give a shout out to, Jennifer Kumiyama, who's also an actress with a disability, who also happens to have a physical disability. She was in a movie that generated a lot of Oscar buzz called The Sessions with John Hawkes. And so John Hawkes did play the title character, but it created opportunities for people like Jennifer and my friend Toby to also be in the film, who also identify as having disabilities. And so we need to hold people, and it was directed by an actor, or it was directed by an individual who also has a disability. So, but it took a team like that, where the director himself also identifies as a person with a disability, to make a movie like that, right? And so, we need to be behind the camera, we need to be writing the scripts, we need to be producing the content, we just need to be more in the mix, because media is a powerhouse. It's really, really important. It helps inform how we operate and function as a society. And if we continue to not see people with disabilities represented, and when we do, misrepresented, it's really, really damaging to our community. And it's something that really needs to be changed. And so, I will be in that fight forever.
I love it. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. Okay. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for
Thank you so
teaching us.
much.
Thank you for being vulnerable and open and teaching us words
Absolutely.
we didn't know, and using language that, or talking about the importance of language. And I hope that this was meaningful to people. I hope that this sparks fire in people. And I also hope that this sparks curiosity in people, for them to ask questions and ask, for permission and things like that, and just fully understand the need for inclusivity, and fully understand the human experience of people that may have live with a disability, and how we can just, live in this world together, cohabitate. So,
Absolutely.
can you tell our viewers, like, where to find you if they, want to follow your fight in this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I will absolutely leave Victoria with my information. And so, hopefully we can maybe post that at the end. But I do invite people to email me and connect with me. And I will leave information for justdetention.org so that folks can see, kind of what I do in my 9 to 5. But people can connect with me on Facebook as well. So absolutely, I just invite people to connect. We need to keep these conversations going. We need to connect with one another. And, I just encourage America to stay curious, right? Like we just need to be curious about one another in a positive and healthy way. And we need to continue to ask questions so that we get some answers. Because I think we need more people like you that are creating spaces for us to have this dialogue. I mean, it's amazing, right? We're talking about the largest quote unquote minority in the country, and it still continues to be the community and culture that we know the least about, and that needs to change. And it starts here. It starts with moments like this. It starts with dialogue like this. So I'm so honored to be here. It was amazing talking to you, and I could do these kinds of things all day long. And we need to. We need to. We need to have more conversations like this. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Victoria, for the invitation. I had an amazing time, and I hope this isn't the end.
Oh, awesome. No, we'll have you back. We'll keep bugging you. All right, Vanessa, thanks for being here. And we want to thank our sponsors, Biogen, for supporting programming like this and meaningful conversations. All right, everybody, that's a wrap. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.